Welcome everyone. This is a Legacy School Science lesson for Biology Chapter 4. This is part 2 of Ecosystem. For this part, you will need your Science Checkpoint Book 3, pages 53 to 62. We talked in part 1 about food chains, and now we will be discussing food webs. When several food chains are studied in a habitat, some species may appear in more than one. For example, a panda eats bamboo. Panda eats bamboo shoots and also eats fish. The two food chains it appears in are bamboo is eaten by a panda, and water plants eaten by the snails eaten by the fish, and the fish eaten by the panda. These food chains can be linked to make a food web. A food web shows the movement of food through a habitat. It can also be used to help predict what might happen if one of the links in the food web was absent. Look at figure 4.9 and think of each animal shown there not just as one animal, but as the whole population of that species of animal in the wood. If you think of each animal in a plural, such as voles and finches, it may help you think about animal population. Now imagine that the trees that had a disease that made their leaves fall off. The caterpillars would starve and die, and they would not be available as food for the robins. This means that the robins must eat more beetles and wood lice if they are not to go hungry. The reduction in the population of wood lice would affect the shrews, and this is their only food. The beetle population would also fall, forcing the foxes to search out more voles to eat. So this is figure 4.9. As we can see, that the plant roots are eaten by the voles, and the voles are eaten by the foxes and the owls. So if anything happened to the vole, then the fox population will be affected and the owl population will be affected as well. The fox and the owl will have to feed on the beetles. They will rely more on the beetles. Ecological pyramids. When a survey of a habitat is complete, ecologists, scientists who study ecosystem can examine the relationship between the different species. They may find, for example, that deers depend on ferns for shelter in a wood, and that some birds use moss to line their nest. The major relationship between organisms in a habitat is the relationship through feeding. It is the relationship that interests ecologists most. By studying the diet of animals in a habitat, ecologists can work out food chains and ecological pyramids. Pyramid of numbers. The simplest type of ecological pyramid is the pyramid of numbers. The number of each species in the food chain in a habitat is estimated. The number of plants may be estimated using a quadrant. The number of small animals may be estimated using traps, nets, and beating branches. The number of large animals, such as birds, may be found by observing and counting. An ecological pyramid is divided into layers or tiers. There is one tier for each species in the food chain. The bottom tier is used to display information about the plant species or producer. The second tier is used for the primary consumer, and the tiers above are used for other consumers in the food chain. The size of the tier represents the number of species in the habitat. If the food chain below is represented as a pyramid of number, it takes the form shown in figure 4.9. So the food chain we have is grass, and the grass is eaten by the rabbits, and the rabbits are eaten by foxes. So in a pyramid of numbers, as we can see, we have the producers are at the bottom tier, and the size of the tier itself shows the number of the species. So as we can see, the first box is bigger than the second, and the second is bigger than the third. The first box containing the plants, which are more in number than the primary consumer, which are the rabbits, and the rabbits are more in number than the secondary consumer, which are the foxes. Not all pyramids of number are widest at the base. For example, a tree creeper is a small brown bird with narrow beak that feeds on insects, which in turn feed on oak trees. The food chain of this feeding relationship is oak trees eaten by insects, the insects eaten by the tree creeper. When the food chain is studied further and a pyramid of number is displayed, it appears as shown in figure 4.11. So as we can see, not the size of the number of the pyramid depends the size of the pyramids depend on the number of species present in that pyramid. For example, if we only have one oak tree and we have about 1,000 beetles, 1,000 insects, and only two birds, then the second tier will be largest in size and the first tier will be smallest in size. The thing is that the bottom tier always represents the producer, the tier above it represents the primary consumer, and the one above it the secondary, and so on. Pyramid of biomass. The amount of matter in a body is found by drying it to remove all water and then using scale to find the mass. The amount of matter is called the biomass. Ecologists find measuring biomass useful as it tells how much matter is locked up in each species of a food chain. Decomposers. Not only do the living bodies of each species provide food for others, but their dead bodies and waste are food too. The dead bodies of plants and animals are food for fungi, bacteria, and small invertebrates that live in the soil and leave litters. These organisms are called decomposers. When they have finished feeding, the bodies of plants and animals become reduced to the substances from which they were made. For example, the carbohydrates in a plant were broken down to carbon dioxide and water as the decomposers respire. Other substances are released from the plant's body as minerals and returned to the soil. Decomposers are recyclers. They recycle the substances from which living things are made so that they can be used again. Ecosystem. Decomposers form one of the links between the living things in a community and the non-living environment. Green plants form the second link. When a community of living things, such as those that make up a woodland, interact with the non-living environment, the decomposers, releasing mineral, carbon dioxide, and water into the environment, and then plants taking them in again. The living and non-living part of an ecosystem the living and non-living part of an ecological system or ecosystem. An ecosystem can be quite small, such as a pond, or as large as a lake or a forest. So this is figure 4.13, and it shows the relationship between the living and the non-living part of the ecosystem as the producers and the consumers, and the decomposers playing parts. The primary and secondary the producers are food for the primary consumers and food for the decomposers, their dead bodies, and the primary consumers are food for the secondary consumer, and the secondary consumer and primary consumer and producers are all food for the decomposers after they die, and then the decomposers themselves return the minerals back to the producers. When the producers and the primary consumer and secondary consumer consume this energy, they release oxygen and carbon dioxide, which in turn returns back to the producers to make more energy. Working out how everything interacts is very complicated, but is essential to ecologists if they are to understand how each species in the ecosystem survives and how it affects other species and the non-living part of the ecosystem. Figure 4.13 shows the living and non-living parts of a very simple ecosystem react together, as we have seen. The ecosystem in an aquarium tank. A pond-life aquarium is a very easy ecosystem to study, as it can be set up inside and observe at any time and in any weather. The glass walls allow you to get close to the living things to observe them. Figure 4.14 shows an aquarium containing a pond ecosystem on a small scale. The fish are scuttlebacks, which are found in North America, China, Europe, and Japan. So as we can see in figure 4.14, we have the algae, which represents the producers, and they are eaten by the by the water snails, and the snails are eaten by the fish, and the fish also eats the algae, and they eat the water fleas. How population change? If an area of ground is cleared of vegetation, it will soon be colonized by new plants and animals. The following is an account of how an area of soil could be colonized. The colonization described is much simpler than what would occur naturally, so that the way in which the plants and animals interact can be seen more clearly. A seed land in the center of a soil patch and germinate. The plant is an ephemeral, which means it has a very short cycle. So it is soon fully grown and producing flowers and seeds. The seeds are scattered over the whole area. They all germinate and grow, so the population of ephemeral plants increases. Outside the area of cleared soil, there are perennial plants, which flower and continue to grow for several years. These have stems with broad leaves that cover the ground. As the population of ephemeral plants increases, the perennial plants grow into the area of cleared soil. The two kinds of plants compete for light, water, and mineral in the soil. As the number of both plants increase, the competition between them also increases. The perennial compete more successfully than the ephemeral plant for the resources in the habitat and produce more offspring. The broad leaves of the perennial plant cover the soil and prevent seed from landing there and germinating. The leaves may also grow over the young ephemeral seedlings. In time, the ephemeral plants that are producing seeds will die, and the stem and broad leaves of the perennial could cover them too. Herbivorous insects land on some of the perennial plants and start to feed on their leaves. They feed and breed, and as their number increase, they spread out over other perennial plants in the area. The population of the perennial plants in the area began to fall, and the population of the ephemeral, which are not eaten by the insects, began to rise. A few carnivorous insects land on the center of the patch. They clamber about on the plant and feed on the herbivorous insects. The well-fed carnivorous insects breed, and their population increase. The population of the herbivorous insects starts to fall. How population change with time? A population of species is the number of individuals present in a habitat. The survival of a species in a habitat depends upon many factors. As prey animals are affected by predators and predators depend on prey, it seems reasonable to suspect that their population size might be linked. Charles Elton was an English ecologist who studied some unusual data to investigate the relationship between prey and predator. He used the records of the Hudson Bay Company in Canada for the years 1845 to 1935. The Hudson Bay Company traded in animal belts, and the records showed the number of belts supplied to the company by trappers each year. Elton studied the numbers of snowshoe hair belts supplied by the trappers, as well as the number of belts of the lynx, which is a predator of the snowshoe hare. The number of belts of each species supplied in each year indicated the size and of the species population in that year. Figure 4.15 shows the graph produced from the data. So this is the graph that produced from the data. We have the green line, which shows the hare, and the blue line, which shows the lynx. As we can see, as the population of the hare increases, the population of the lynx increases with it, and as the population of the hare decreases, the population of the lynx decreases with it. Predicting changes in population. The changing size of the human population can be predicted by comparing birth rates with death rates. The birth rate is the number of babies born per thousand people in the population in a year. The death rate is the number of people dying per thousand people in the population in a year. If the birth rate is greater than the death rate, the population will increase in size. If the death rate is greater than the birth rate, the population will decrease in size. If the birth rate and the death rates are the same, the population will remain unchanged. Birth rates, death rates, and conservation. Many endangered mammal species have been reduced to a small world population by hunting. The animals have been killed more quickly than they can reproduce. If the death rate exceeds the birth rate, the species is set on a course of extinction. Many mammals are now threatened with this course. They can be helped by raising their birth rate and reducing their death rates. Zoos can help increase the size of the world population of some endangered animal species. They increase the birth rate by ensuring that all the adult animals in their care are healthy enough to breed and by providing extra care in the rearing of the young. Zoos also reduce the death rate by protecting the animals from predation. In many countries, reserves have been set up in which endangered animals live naturally but are protected from hunting by humans. This reduces their death rate, which in turn increases the birth rate as more animals survive to reach maturity and breed. The human population. The human population of the Earth reached 1 billion, 1,000,000,000 in 1804. 200 years later, the figure was over 6 times greater. Table 4.1 shows the rise in population to 6 billion and the estimated population in the future. Habitat survey. People have been surveying habitats since the earliest time. The purpose was to find fruit, seeds, and roots as well as animals such as mammals and birds to eat. Much later, when countries in Europe sent out sailing ships to explore the world, habitat surveys were made at each new land that was visited. They were not called habitat survey, they were just journeys through the new land where the first explorers, often with no scientific knowledge, observed and collected specimens. The explorers wrote down their observation and brought specimens home, by which time they were usually dead and in some form of decay. However, the arrival of specimens from new lands fired the interest of scientists, and eventually the expedition became more scientific. Artists took part to draw specimens in their habitat, and scientists recorded observation more systematically in notebooks and preserved dead specimens in bottles of alcohol for the journey home. In the 1950s, television companies sent out expeditions in which the plant and animals of a habitat were recorded on film. Wildlife film like this are still being made today and stimulate many people to take up a career in biology. There is a second type of habitat survey taking place today, which is much more scientific. The aim of these surveys is to describe the habitat as accurately as possible for two reasons. First, the habitat might be that of a rare or endangered species, so the purpose is to discover how the activities of the species link with other species and so work out the best way of setting up a conservation program. Second, the habitat may be one that is under threat from the human population and the land on which it stands is being considered for building houses and factories or for flooding to make a reservoir for a hydroelectric power station. So how are habitat surveys made today? Here are the stages that you would go through if you were a scientist carrying out such a survey. The chances are that even the most remote habitat have been visited by scientists in the past, and there may be records of their observation that can be examined. This process of looking at record recorded data and accounts um, of previous journeys in the habitat is called the Ecological Desk Survey. Next, the scientists visit the habitat and make a survey in which they note down its features and make a map. They also talk to people who live locally about the plants and animals they have seen. Often, these local people have a different language from the scientist and may have several names for a plant or an animal. After the survey, transects are set up over the habitat. Along each transect at regular intervals, stations are set up at which the scientists record what they can see or hear. They assess the number of each species at that station using the DAFOR code. The letters stand for dominant, abundant, frequent, occasional, rare. On the walk out along the transect, the abundance of the different species of animals might be recorded along with their activities. On the return walk, the abundance of plants might be noted together with their condition. For example, the plant might be in flower or bearing fruit. If there is a term, if there is a team of scientists, each one may walk a transect at different times in the day. Night surveys are also taken. This is when the scientists walk the transect in darkness and note the animals heard or seen by torchlight. A bat recorder may be switched on to record the sounds of bats, which humans cannot hear. If insect traps have been set up, this can be examined. At some stations, photo traps can be set up in which a camera triggered by a harmless tripwire records an image of any animal that passes by after the scientists have gone. Surveys along these lines are taking place all over the world right now. One example is along the Kenyan coast, where rainforest surveys are being made in the study of black and white colobus monkeys, which are an endangered species. This is the end of this lesson. I'll see you again soon.